I think it's fair to say that these last 2 months have been pretty stressful for everyone. And yes, I do mean everyone. If your internet connection is strong enough for you to be watching this video, you know what I'm talking about, so I don't really need to mention it. In fact, the only reason I'm bringing it up at all is to talk about stress. Stress sucks. We all know that. It makes you depressed, it makes you irritable, it makes it harder to do just about everything. Stress can ruin your life. In some circumstances, it can even end it. So for every person on Earth, the question of how you deal with stress is a very important one. Some people exercise to work off stress. Other people read, or watch weird YouTube videos featuring low-quality images made in MS Paint. Personally, I play video games. But not just any video games. I have my own roster of relaxing games that I turn to when times are tough. I'm talking Kirby's Epic Yarn. I'm talking Symphony of the Night. I'm talking Paper Mario, Animal Crossing, and of course the king of them all, Sanrio Picross. These stress relief games tend to be very simple, approachable experiences that, even if they're not easy per se, are at least relatively easygoing. And that's what makes my latest addition to this pantheon rather unusual. You see, the game I've found most relaxing to play recently also happens to be one of the most challenging games I've ever played. It's Shadow of the Colossus. You wouldn't think on the face of it that Shadow of the Colossus is a relaxing game. It's a sequence of 16 epic boss fights, each more exciting and difficult than the last. Well, mostly. Its story is dark, and its setting lonely and forbidding. You spend most of your time in it wandering through the ruins of a lost civilization, and the rest of it battling huge monsters who treat you like an insect. But it's also a game that makes you think. In fact, you spend a lot more time thinking in Shadow of the Colossus than you do fighting. And that's what makes it a relaxing game to me. It's meditative. It encourages you to examine the world around you, to see it as a world, and not just a backdrop for action. After all, most of the time, nothing's happening anyway. In fact, Shadow of the Colossus gave me possibly the most zen experience I've ever had playing a video game. What do I mean by zen, you ask? Well, strap in, because this'll take a while. To start with, Zen is a Japanese branch of Buddhism. So to talk about Zen, we really need to talk about Buddhism first. And to really understand Buddhism, we have to talk about the broader religious and social context that produced Buddhism to begin with. And to understand that, we have to talk about the history of human culture in Asia. And to understand that, we have to talk about the rise of modern humans 500,000 years ago. And to understand that, we have to talk about the emergence of life on Earth. And to understand that, we have to talk about the beginning of the universe. You know what? For now, let's stick to Buddhism. Most of you probably already know the basics here. Buddhism was started by a guy named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived about 2,500 years ago. He was an aristocrat who renounced his wealth in order to examine the true nature of life, and he eventually came to one basic conclusion. Life kind of sucks. The reason it sucks is because people don't understand the truth and desire evil things, which is why they're stuck in an endless cycle of reincarnation and suffering, which he called samsara. He taught that if people lived good lives and meditated on the truth, they would ultimately reach nirvana, literally blowing out, and be free from pain and worry. In recognition of his wisdom, Gautama's disciples gave him the title Buddha, which means enlightened. The Buddha's philosophy was a pretty simple one. Be thoughtful, do the right thing, don't be distracted by earthly pleasures, and think about stuff a lot. It was so simple, in fact, that pretty much right after he died, his disciples immediately broke off into splinter groups and started arguing about what he really meant. These different sects eventually coalesced into two main rival movements, Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. It's important to remember at this point that the Buddha is not in fact the only Buddha in Buddhism. Anyone who reaches nirvana is just as much a Buddha as the OG Buddha. But the two major sects of Buddhism disagree about how people are supposed to get there. Theravada, literally the school of the elders, is the more mystical and introspective of the two movements. It teaches that the point of Buddhism is to become an arhat, a fully enlightened being, on your own and totally through mental effort. Mahayana, literally great vehicle, is the more pragmatic and worldly of the two. It teaches that the real point of Buddhism is to become a bodhisattva, a mostly enlightened being who chooses to stay in this world and assist others on the path to enlightenment, so that ideally everyone would reach nirvana at about the same time. Zen is an offshoot of Mahayana Buddhism that started in China around the 5th century AD, where it was known as Chan, meaning meditation. As well as Buddhism, Zen was also strongly influenced by the indigenous Chinese philosophy of Taoism, which emphasizes detachment from worldly affairs, harmony with nature, and the practice of empathy toward all living things. Since it came from a more practical and worldly school of Buddhism, Zen emphasizes the importance of discipline and meditation in everyday life, and the applicability of Buddhist philosophy to practical concerns. Partly because of this, it became very popular among samurai as a guiding philosophy, similar to the influence of Christianity on Western knights. Samurai believed that Zen would make them stronger on the battlefield, as well as more successful and content at home. And, as all popular religions do, Zen also broke into different schools over the years. There's Soto Zen, which focuses on open, freewheeling meditation, Rinzai Zen, which focuses on personal introspection and the study of traditional puzzles known as koan, and Fuke Zen, which focuses on wandering around playing a giant flute and wearing a basket on your head. This is actually true. The essence of Zen is using meditation to see through surface appearances. Koan, for instance, are anecdotes that seem paradoxical, but contain a deeper truth. The famous Zen garden that sat on countless office desks in the 1980s is made up of sand and pebbles because its existence as a garden is metaphorical and not real. And Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance looks like a psychology textbook, but is actually Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, except with motorcycles. So that's Zen. It's a moral code, it's a philosophy to live by, and it's a set of problems that test your wisdom. It was a big deal in China, it was an even bigger deal in Japan, and its influence on art and culture was subtle but surprisingly deep. Which brings us back by a somewhat circuitous route to Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus is an action-adventure game published and co-developed by Sony and originally released on the PlayStation 2 in late 2005, barely a year before the PS3 came out. Its lead designer, Fumito Ueda, was already well known for making Ico back in 2001, a game that showed off his very unique and uncompromising approach to game design. Ueda's fans probably could have guessed that his next project would also break the mold, but exactly how it would do so must have come as a bit of a surprise to everybody. You see, in many ways, Shadow of the Colossus is a more traditional game than Ico. It has a tutorial, a hint system, power-ups, regular boss encounters, a health bar, and lots of other things that normally mark a game out as being gamey. It also has a lot more dialogue than Ico, and a story that's a lot more straightforward and fleshed out. Because of this, it's a bit difficult to explain what makes Shadow of the Colossus a special and distinct experience. A lot of people have focused on the game's structure, 16 intense boss fights separated by long periods of challenge-free exploration. It's true that not many combat-focused games completely leave out encounters against regular enemies, but I question whether this is really as huge a departure from the norm as it's often claimed to be. Many games feature boss fights as the main challenge and selling point of the experience, and in quite a few of them the stretches in between bosses aren't that difficult or interesting. Also, structure doesn't necessarily dictate the tone of a game. You could easily make a boss rush game based on ironic humor, or fist-pumping action, or lots of other things. I'm not saying that the structure doesn't contribute to Shadow of the Colossus' unique atmosphere. What I'm saying is that it doesn't do that by itself. It's part of a bigger picture, and most of that picture is formed by dozens of little details about the game's design. Just listing these details wouldn't do justice to them, so I'm going to give some context by showing them to you as they happen. We're going to take a look at one of its 16 boss fights and examine the Zen-ness of this game close up. But first, speaking of context, maybe this would be a good time to actually go over the game's story. Shadow of the Colossus opens with a young man riding a horse into an abandoned temple far from human civilization. The man, whom Ueda calls Wander, although his name is never mentioned in the story, takes a heavy object wrapped in a shroud from his horse's back and places it on a nearby dais. As the shroud flies off in the wind, we see what it was covering all this time: the dead body of a girl, whom Ueda has referred to as Mono. Wander calls upon the spirit residing in this temple, known as Dorman, to resurrect Mono, whose connection to Wander is, and will likely forever be, a mystery. Dorman notes that the law of humanity is that the dead cannot be brought back to life, but offers a note of hope. In the forbidden land where he resides, such supernatural power does in fact exist. Dorman proposes a bargain. If Wander will track down and slay 16 Colossi, the only other inhabitants of this forbidden land, then Dorman will use its power to return Mono's soul to her body. However, he warns that the price for doing this may be higher than Wander is prepared to pay. Undeterred, Wander immediately sets out to track and kill the first Colossus. The Colossi are the most unique aspect of Shadow of the Colossus, as well as its most tantalizing mystery. What are they exactly? Why are they the only living inhabitants of this realm, besides a few scattered birds and lizards? Were they born or made? And if they were made, what purpose were they made for? There are only a few certainties about the Colossi. First, they're all large. The smallest is about 3 times as big as Wander, and the largest is practically the size of a mountain. Second, although they mostly appear like statues, similar to the stone representations of them in Dorman's temple, they all seem to possess living tissue as well. Hair, bones, fins, muscle, and of course, black blood that gushes from the wounds Wander inflicts on them. Finally, the Colossi clearly have some kind of intimate connection with the places they inhabit, judging by how Dorman describes them and the appearance of the areas where you find them. I won't spoil the game's ending, first of all because I don't want to ruin it for you, and second because I don't need to. What we've already covered is enough to work with, so let's go a little more in depth. How does all this go back to Zen? And why did I say earlier that Shadow of the Colossus feels relaxing to me? Well, let's take a close-up look and find out by running through the sequence of events associated with fighting the 8th Colossus, midway through the game. Before Wander sets out to find this Colossus, Dorman tells him cryptically that it is a tail trapped within a pail, and a shadow that crawls on the walls. As with all the other Colossi, it has no given name, and its exact appearance is a mystery until you find it. The statues lining Dorman's temple don't help much. They're clearly stylized and simplified versions of the Colossi, and come across more as totems than as actual representations of what they look like. The 8th statue, for instance, is vaguely reptilian, but gives no clues as to its size or the threat that it poses. Learning to confront the unknown is a theme that reappears constantly, both in Western Stoic philosophy and Zen Buddhism. Like Wander, a samurai would often have to travel through unfamiliar territory and face threats for which his previous experience had not prepared him. The solution, according to Zen philosophy, was keen observation and quick thinking, not surprisingly the two qualities that Shadow of the Colossus tests most often in its gameplay. As Wander mounts his horse aggro and takes off in the direction of the Colossus, no music plays. The only noises you hear, apart from the wind, are aggro's grunts and hoofbeats. One unexpected result of this is that it makes the horse's presence very striking. The game never lets you forget that aggro is there, which makes you appreciate him more. This is reinforced by the fact that aggro is only partially controlled by the player. Your inputs are limited to kicking aggro's side to get him to speed up, and turning the reins, which after a short delay causes aggro to turn in the same direction. In general, aggro behaves like an actual animal with feelings, not a vehicle controlled by the player. Wander clearly respects and cherishes aggro, who in turn saves his life on multiple occasions. This connects to the general Taoist theme that all living things are unique and precious, not tools to be used and discarded at will. Wander and aggro aren't a master and a servant, they're a team. After riding over several miles of wilderness, Wander enters a huge cave with a waterfall in the distance. The noise of the waterfall is loud, but repetitive and soothing, much like white noise. Incidentally, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that meditating under a waterfall is a familiar trope in Japanese literature. Anyway, at the far end of the cave is an elaborate stone building, similar to the one which Wander discovered while looking for the 6th Colossus earlier. These buildings, along with the save shrines dotted around the overworld, are the only signs that people once lived in the land where Shadow of the Colossus is set. Their scale, however, is very confusing. These temples are far too large to have been built by or for someone Wander's size, but they're also far too small to have been built for anything as big as the Colossi. The implication is that a third, totally unknown civilization built them, one which may perhaps have created the Colossi, but certainly weren't anywhere near their size. This brings us to another concept related to Zen, and really to Buddhism as a whole, the transience of earthly things. Everything in Shadow of the Colossus is mortal, and doomed to eventually disappear. The Colossi, despite their obvious supernatural origin, can be killed. Wander faces death constantly, and the physical changes he undergoes suggest a gradual sickness and deterioration of his body. It's implied that even Dorman, an immensely powerful spirit with death-defying powers, is in its own way vulnerable and susceptible to the ravages of time. This is kind of depressing. Let's move on. In a vast underground Colosseum, the Pale that Dorman spoke of, Wander finally encounters the Colossus. It turns out to be an armored salamander-like creature that, as Dorman hinted, crawls along the walls and shoots a torrent of fiery gas at you. To defeat it, you must shoot arrows at its legs to dislodge it from the wall, then leap onto its unprotected belly, where a glowing weak point appears for you to stab. I think it's worth noting at this point that the way Wander fights his opponents in this game is also very much in keeping with the tenets of Zen. As Miyamoto Musashi recommended in his Book of Five Rings, he avoids flashy and wasteful displays of strength, demonstrates proficiency with multiple weapons, and uses his mind to discover vulnerabilities in even the most invincible-looking foes. One of the most engaging aspects of Shadow of the Colossus is the puzzle-like nature of the bosses, which makes you feel like you're dealing with a real threat, and not a contrived cage match. When the Colossus is finally slain, black tendrils emerge from the slain Colossus's body and briefly snake through the sky before plunging into Wander's body, causing him to collapse and pass out. In most games, defeating a boss is a triumphant moment that makes the player feel proud, but the mournful music and disturbing imagery that accompanies it in Shadow of the Colossus makes you feel more like a butcher than a hero. After most of the Colossi, the only real feeling I had was relief that the battle was over. In other words, the game put me in Wander's shoes. Wander doesn't revel in violence, or enjoy it for its own sake. The only reason he's doing this is because he wants to bring Mono back, and killing these majestic creatures is at best a necessary evil. This ambivalence is also shown through a series of physical changes. After each Colossus is defeated, Wander's hair turns a shade darker, his skin grows paler, and eventually a pattern of spidery scars appears on his face and hands. Taoism, which was a strong influence on Zen, was fundamentally about respecting nature and the fragile network of relationships that exists between all living things. Sometimes, its disciples suggest, human carelessness and greed can sever these ties and cause great suffering as a result. This is what's happening through most of Shadow of the Colossus, although no one ever explicitly says so. Many games have cast the player as more of a villain than a hero, but it's rare for it to be done with this much subtlety. Most games that criticize the player character for being violent or antisocial are pretty on the nose about it, and end up feeling hypocritical as a result. Spec Ops: The Line tricks players into committing atrocities, then berates them for it. Undertale basically calls you a sociopath for wanting to see a no-mercy run that its creator spent countless hours designing just so you could be yelled at for wanting to see it. And then there's games like Hotline Miami or Metal Gear Solid, where the implied criticism has almost nothing to do with the game's design and seems like an afterthought. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, is non-judgmental, so much so that it occasionally comes across as indifferent to your actions. The only other game I've played that approaches this kind of melancholic but serene tone is Demon's Souls. I don't think it's any coincidence that Sony's Japan studio co-developed both games. And if these games are ambivalent about the morality of your actions, that's in keeping with the spirit of Zen too. One of the most famous lines in the Tao Te Ching reads, "Heaven and earth are heartless, regarding all things as straw dogs." The straw dogs mentioned here are Chinese sacrificial objects, used in rituals only once and then thrown away. Zen philosophers, like Western Stoics, did not believe that good fortune was a sign of divine favor, or that misfortune came from incurring the god's wrath. Instead, they saw both good and bad luck as natural aspects of life that everyone must cope with at times. Miyamoto Musashi put the idea into words this way: respect the gods without counting on them. Or, as a familiar Western proverb goes, God helps those who help themselves. So you might be wondering at this point, hey, what does all this have to do with stress? Didn't I say at the beginning of this video that I find Shadow of the Colossus relaxing? How does that fit in with its somber tone, depressing story, and tension-inducing gameplay? The answer is catharsis. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the most cathartic games I've ever played. It ramps up tension and atmosphere all the way up to the fights with each Colossus, then releases the tension after the fight is over, and the sense of relief that accompanies each victory is intense. It's like getting a really good massage, but for your brain instead of your back. Few games have ever been as intelligently paced as Shadow of the Colossus, too. The traveling sections in between battles are simple enough to give you time to think about what's happened, and the punctuating moments of action are complex enough to make you want to think about them. Its atmosphere gives you a sense of detachment that lets you view Wander, the Colossi, and the world as parts of a greater whole, which in a sense is the essence of Zen. Many people find meditation relaxing, and playing Shadow of the Colossus is like meditating. It spurs your mind into thinking without necessarily directing your attention to any specific theme or message. It's a game that wants you to think without trying to push you into thinking a certain way, which frankly comes across as a lot more mature than the morality systems of many games, in which, as a noted game critic said so long ago, it seems like you're never given any choice between Mother Teresa virtuousness and baby-eating villainy. I don't mean any disrespect when I say that Shadow of the Colossus isn't for everybody. The moral grayness, the downbeat atmosphere, and the absence of traditional gameplay are all things that some people are bound to hate, and it's not like those people are too dumb to get it. Honestly, there's not a lot to get in the first place. Personally, though, I find it relaxing. It's one of the few game worlds that I'm happy just to explore without any clear goal in mind, just to see what it looks like in a totally unstructured way. And in these times of intense stress and political shouting matches, with fear and anger being whipped up on all sides, it's nice to have a peaceful world like this to escape into. So play your comfort game, whatever it is. If it gives you the mental space you need to work out your problems, relieves your stress, and makes the world a little easier to understand, then it's a good thing. After all, video games and Zen both exist for the same reason, to make people's lives happier. At least I think they do.